Welcome to our channel. Hollywood Movie Review. Patton 1970 Movie Review. Patton is a 1970 American epic biographical war film about U.S. General George S. Patton during World War II. It stars George C. Scott as Patton and Karl Malden as General Omar Bradley. The film was directed by Franklin J. Schaffner from a script by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North, who based their screenplay on Patton, Ordeal and Triumph by Lottie S. La's Farrago and Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story. Patton premiered in New York City on February 5, 1970 before being released by 20th Century Fox on April 2, 1970. The film grossed $61.7 million against a budget of $12 million. It won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Original Screenplay. Scott also won the Best Actor for his performance, though he declined the award. The opening monologue, delivered by Scott as General Patton with an enormous American flag behind him, remains an iconic and often quoted image in film. In 2003, Patton was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The Academy Film Archive also preserved Patton in 2003. During World War II, the II Corps suffers a severe defeat at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in North Africa. Hard-charging General George S. Patton is sent to take command. He reorganizes the Corps, and imposes strict but necessary discipline. Frustrated by what he perceives as British Commander Bernard Montgomery's monopolization of the Allied effort, Montgomery's forces had chased Rommel's forces and thus relieved pressure on the Americans following Kasserine. Patton leads the Corps to redemption at the Battle of El Guetar. Following Allied victory in North Africa, Patton and Montgomery propose competing plans for the Allied invasion of Sicily. Patton recommends landing his U.S. 7th Army near Palermo. Commanding Officer Harold Alexander opts for Montgomery's more cautious plan, landing Patton's forces at Gela. Although initially intended to support Montgomery, Patton pushes northwest, taking Palermo and racing to Messina before the British. During the campaign, he visits a field hospital and slaps a soldier for cowardice, sparking public outrage and requiring a formal apology. Patton is then sidelined by Eisenhower for the Allied invasion of France and placed in command of the fictitious 1st United States Army Group in London, a decoy to mislead the Germans about the main invasion location. At a public gathering in Knutsford, Patton remarks that the post-war world will be dominated by Anglo-Americans, alarming Allied leaders. George Marshall must decide whether Patton's outspoken comments warrant sending him home in disgrace. Weeks after the Normandy landings, Patton takes command of the Third Army, reporting to his former subordinate, Omar Bradley. Under his leadership, the Third Army sweeps across France, but is forced to halt before entering Germany due to fuel and supply allocations to Montgomery's forces. Frustrated, Patton confronts Bradley, who warns him again about the dangers of speaking freely. During the Battle of the Bulge, Patton's staff plans a bold operation to relieve the trapped 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne. After Germany capitulates, Patton's candid comparisons of American politics to Nazism create further controversy, and he is relieved of command of the Third Army. He is retained to help oversee the occupation of Germany. In the film's closing sequence, Patton narrowly avoids a fatal accident while walking with his bull terrier, and his voiceover reflects on the fleeting nature of glory, especially that achieved through military conquest. For over 1,000 years, Roman conquerors returning from the wars enjoyed the honor of a triumph, a tumultuous parade. In the procession came trumpeters and musicians and strange animals from the conquered territories, together with carts laden with treasure and captured armaments. The conqueror rode in a triumphal chariot, the dazed prisoners walking in chains before him. Sometimes his children, robed in white, stood with him in the chariot, or rode the trace horses. Attempts to make a film about the life of Patton had been made since he died in 1945, but his widow, Beatrice, resisted. After her death in 1953, producer Frank McCarthy began the project and, the day after Beatrice was buried, the producers contacted the family for help in making the film, requesting access to Patton's diaries, as well as input from family members, but the family declined to help. McCarthy also sought cooperation from the Pentagon. It also initially refused, as Patton's son, George Patton IV, was in the Army, and Patton's second daughter, Ruth, was married to an officer. By 1959, McCarthy had convinced the Army to cooperate. 20th Century Fox bought A Soldier's Story, the 1951 autobiography of General of the Army Omar Bradley, who features prominently in the film, played by Karl Malden. Francis Ford Coppola wrote the film script in 1963 based largely on Lottie S. L. Farrago's 1963 biography Patton, Ordeal and Triumph, and on A Soldier's Story. Edmund H. North was later brought in to help work on the script. The film was originally to be called Blood and Guts, and William Wyler was originally scheduled to direct. Wyler quit before the planned starting date of January 1969. Bradley, the only surviving five-star general officer in the United States after the death of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1969, served as a consultant for the film, though the extent of his influence and input into the final script is largely unknown. While Bradley knew Patton, it was also well known that the two men were opposites in personality, and there is evidence that Bradley despised Patton. As the film was made without Patton's diaries, it largely relied upon observations by Bradley and attempts by other military contemporaries to reconstruct Patton's thoughts and motives. In a review of the film, Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, who knew both Patton and Bradley, stated, "The Bradley name gets heavy billing on a picture of a comrade that, while not caricature, is the likeness of a victorious, glory-seeking buffoon. Patton in the flesh was an enigma. He so stays in the film." Napoleon once said that the art of the general is not strategy but knowing how to mold human nature. Maybe that is all producer Frank McCarthy and Gen. Bradley, his chief advisor, are trying to say. The film started shooting February 3, 1969 and was shot at 71 locations in 6 countries, mostly in Spain, which had a lot of the U.S. Army's World War II surplus equipment. 1210 Francois Spain had sustained a currency control for decades, and filming in the country was the only way to indirectly recover the profits of the box office from American films. Cheap labor also encouraged runaway productions. One scene, which depicts Patton driving up to an ancient city that is implied to be Carthage, was shot in the ancient Roman Mauritanian city of Volubilis, Morocco. The early scene, where Patton and Muhammad V are reviewing Moroccan troops including the Gumirs, was shot at the Royal Palace in Rabat. One unannounced battle scene was shot the night before, which raised fears in the Royal Palace neighborhood of a coup d'état. One paratrooper was electrocuted in power lines, but none of this battle footage appears in the film. The scene at the dedication of the Welcome Centre in Knutsford, Cheshire, England, was filmed at the actual site. The scenes set in Tunisia and Sicily were shot in Almeria in the south of Spain. Pamplona in the north was used for France and Germany, while the winter scenes in Belgium, including for the Battle of the Bulge sequence, were shot near Segovia, to which the production crew rushed when they were informed that snow had fallen. Interior shots were filmed in Seville. The film was shot by cinematographer Fred J. Koenikamp in 65mm dimension 150, only the second film to be shot in that format after The Bible, In the Beginning. 1966. A sizable amount of battle scene footage was left out of the final cut of Patton, but a use was soon found for it. Outtakes from Patton were used to provide battle scenes in the made-for-TV film Fireball Forward, which was first broadcast in 1972. The film was produced by Patton producer Frank McCarthy, and Edmund North wrote the screenplay. One of the cast members of Patton, Morgan Paul, appeared in this production. The film opens with Scott's rendering of Patton's speech to the Third Army, set against a huge American flag. Coppola and North had to tone down Patton's actual words and statements in the scene, as well as throughout the rest of the film, to avoid an R rating. In the opening monologue, the word fornicating replaced fucking when he was criticizing the Saturday Evening Post. Also, Scott's gravelly and scratchy voice is the opposite of Patton's high-pitched, nasal, and somewhat squeaky voice, a point noted by historian S.L.A. Marshall. However, Marshall also points out that the film contains too much cursing and obscenity by Patton. Patton was not habitually foul-mouthed. He used dirty words when he thought they were needed to impress. When Scott learned that the speech would open the film, he refused to do it, as he believed that it would overshadow the rest of his performance. Director Schaffner assured him that it would be shown at the end. The scene was shot in one afternoon at Sevilla Studios in Madrid, with the flag having been painted on the back of the stage wall. All the medals and decorations shown on Patton's uniform in the monologue are replicas of those actually awarded to Patton. However, the general never wore all of them in public and was in any case not a four-star general at the time he made the famous speeches on which the opening is based. He wore them all on only one occasion, in his backyard in Virginia at the request of his wife, who wanted a picture of him with all his medals. The producers used a copy of this photo to help recreate this look for the opening scene. The critically acclaimed score was composed and conducted by Jerry Goldsmith and performed by the Hollywood Studio Symphony. Goldsmith used a number of innovative methods to tie the music to the film, such as having an echoplex loop recorded sounds of call to war triplets played on the trumpet to musically represent General Patton's belief in reincarnation. The main theme also consisted of a symphonic march accompanied by a pipe organ to represent the militaristic yet deeply religious nature of the protagonist. The music to Patton subsequently earned Goldsmith an Oscar nomination for Best Original Score and was one of the American Film Institute's 250 nominees for the top 25 American film scores. The original soundtrack has been released 3 times on disc and once on LP, through 20th Century Fox Records in 1970, Tsunami Records in 1992, Film Score Monthly in 1999, and a 2-disc extended version through Intrada Records in 2010. The film had its premiere on Wednesday, February 4, 1970, at the Criterion Theater in New York before its roadshow release starting the following day. Patton was first telecast by ABC as a 3 hours plus color film special on Sunday, November 19, 1972, only 2 years after its theatrical release. That was highly unusual at the time, especially for a roadshow release which had played in theaters for many months. Most theatrical films at that time had to wait at least 5 years for their first telecast. Another unusual element of the telecast was that almost none of Patton's profanity-laced dialogue was cut. Only 2 sentences, one of which contained no profanity, were cut from the famous opening speech in front of the giant U.S. flag. The film was the 4th highest-rated film broadcast on television in the United States at the time, with a Nielsen rating of 38.5 and an audience share of 65%. In 1977, Patton was among the first 50 VHS and Betamax releases from Magnetic Video. The film would be released on Laserdisc in 1981, also by Magnetic Video. A widescreen version was released in 1989, which includes 4 newsreels about the real Patton. A THX-certified Laserdisc would be released on July 9, 1997, trading the newsreels for many new features. A THX-certified widescreen VHS was also released in 1998 by the same distributor, 20th Century Fox Home Entertainment. Patton was first released on DVD in 1999, featuring an audio commentary by Charles M. Province, the founder of the George S. Patton Jr. Historical Society, and again in 2006, with a commentary by screenwriter Francis Ford Coppola and extra bonus features. The film made its Region A, locked, Blu-ray debut in 2008 to much criticism, for its excessive use of digital noise reduction on the picture quality. In 2012, a remaster was released with much improved picture quality. In June 2013, Fox UK released the film on Region B Blu-ray but reverted to the 2008 transfer. The film grossed an estimated $51,000 in its first week. According to Fox Records, the film required $22,525,000 in theatrical rentals to break even, and by December 11, 1970 had made $27,650,000, so made a profit to the studio. Eventually, it returned worldwide rentals of $45 million, including $28.1 million from the United States and Canada from a gross of $61.7 million. Roger Ebert said of George C. Scott's portrayal of Patton, "It is one of those sublime performances in which the personalities of the actor and the character are fulfilled in one another." Gene Siskel gave the film 3 stars out of 4 and wrote that George C. Scott has created an acting tour de force, but found it repetitive. The second half doesn't tell us anything more than the first. Vincent Canby of the New York Times wrote, "The most refreshing thing about Patton is that here I think for the first time the subject matter and the style of the epic war movie are perfectly matched. Although the cast is large, the only performance of note is that of Scott, who is continuously entertaining and, occasionally, very appealing." Charles Champlin of the Los Angeles Times wrote, "Patton has, like Lawrence of Arabia, done the near impossible by creating a finely detailed portrait despite all the tuggings towards simplification which are inevitable in the big-budget, long, loud roadshow production desperate to attract mass audiences." As Patton, George Scott gives one of the great and unforgettable screen characterizations. Gary Arnold of the Washington Post wrote that the film eventually shares the dramatic limitations, as well as the visual triumphs, of Lawrence of Arabia, yet another fascinating but inconclusive portrait of a mercurial military leader. The camera focus is sharp, but the dramatic focus is blurred. We never quite understand Patton in historical context, in relation to the other generals of the period, and to the entire Allied war effort. Pauline Kael of The New Yorker wrote that technically the movie is awesomely impressive, but went on to state that "I'm sure it will be said that the picture is true to Patton and to history, but I think it strings us along and holds out on us. If we don't just want to have our prejudices greased, we'll find it confusing and unsatisfying, because we aren't given enough information to evaluate Patton's actions." John Gillette of the Monthly Film Bulletin wrote, "While communicating a relish for the man with all his warts, Schaffner also pinpoints the monstrous prejudices which lay beneath the surface. And, of course, he chose the right actor. Karl Malden's Bradley is neatly observed and the German players are good, but Scott's performance rightly dwarfs all the rest." Online. Film critic James Berardinelli has called Patton his favorite film of all time and to this day one of Hollywood's most compelling biographical war pictures. According to Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's book The Final Days, it was Richard Nixon's favorite film. Nixon first viewed Patton with his family at a private screening in the White House Family Theater on April 5, 1970. Nixon became obsessed with the film, repeatedly watching it with Henry Kissinger over the next month. He screened it several times at the White House and during a cruise on the presidential yacht USS Sequoia in the Potomac River. Kissinger sarcastically wrote of Nixon's insistence that he see the film on the cruise, "It was the second time he had so honored me." Inspiring as the film no doubt was, I managed to escape for an hour in the middle of it to prepare for the next day's NSC meeting. On review aggregation website Rotten Tomatoes, Patton has a 90% approval rating based on 52 reviews, with an average score of 8.4/10. Its critical consensus reads, "George C. Scott's sympathetic, unflinching portrayal of the titular general in this sprawling epic is as definitive as any performance in the history of American biopics." 42 on Metacritic. It has a score of 86% based on reviews from 20 critics, indicating universal acclaim. In 1971, the film was nominated for 10 Academy Awards at the 1971 ceremony, winning 7 awards, including Best Picture. George C. Scott also won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his performance, but he declined it, citing a dislike of the voting process and the concept of acting competitions. He was the first actor to do so. The film's producer, Frank McCarthy, accepted the award on Scott's behalf. The Best Picture statuette is on display at the George C. Marshall Museum at the Virginia Military Institute, courtesy of Frank McCarthy. In my youth, I maintained a serious bias against older films, and even though 1970's Patton isn't all that old, I pretty much plopped any film I couldn't remember from its theatrical run into that category. I was 3 when Patton hit the screens. Patton was one of the first movies to show me what narrow-minded bonehead I was. Lawrence of Arabia sealed the deal. I always envisioned these older movies as being stilted, dull affairs, but those 2 films clearly demonstrated how wrong I was. Lawrence of Arabia is maybe the best historical film ever made, but Patton isn't far behind. While Lawrence is the better film, I think Patton qualifies as the superior biography simply because I feel it remains truer to its subject. Lawrence clearly takes many licenses with the facts, whereas Patton sticks closer to reality. George C. Scott's career-defining performance as General George S. Patton remains key to the success of this film. Scott had many successes before and after Patton, but it remains the role for which he will be best remembered. He won, and famously refused, his Oscar for it, and it's an absolutely perfect performance. He completely loses himself in the part, and he's able to draw a solid picture of the man. Scott's work in this film stands out not just for 1970 but for all motion picture acting. It's one of those performances that will always be held up as a model. Also very good is Karl Malden as General Omar Bradley. To be frank, I always found Malden's Bradley to be just a little too genial and sweet, something that I couldn't help but feel was influenced by the fact that the real Bradley served as a consultant for the film. I'm not saying Bradley wasn't really a good guy, but I simply get the feeling that some rough edges may have been smoothed out because of his involvement. It's much easier to be blunt with historical characters when they're dead, or at least when they don't act as consultants on the films in question. Nonetheless, the Bradley character works well to illustrate the foibles of Patton and neatly shows the different ways that officers could do things. Bradley's simple, folksy way contrasts neatly with the harsh egotism of Patton, and the differences heighten our awareness of Patton's flaws, so while Bradley does seem a bit too soft, this method nonetheless works well in the interest of the story. Franklin Schaffner directs the film in a fairly workmanlike manner. He lacks much flair, but he tells the story efficiently, effectively, and without unnecessary sentimentality. Some of the battle scenes fall a little flat. A relatively early engagement in North Africa seems to drag, but since the film really isn't about fighting, that's not a significant problem. While it'd be nice if Schaffner could portray war in the visceral and kinetic manner Steven Spielberg demonstrated in Saving Private Ryan, I'm happy to note that he is able to avoid Spielberg's overwrought sentimentality and his tendency to telegraph his points. Schaffner occasionally betrays some bias during the movie, but Patton really appears remarkably free of any particular ideological taint. It's a film that can easily be claimed for either hawks or doves. Individual interpretations of Patton as a man and as a warrior are wide open. Take the slapping scene, for example. Does this depict a cruel, insensitive man who views his underlings as nothing but pawns in his struggles for power, or does it show a man with a strong sense of morality, purpose, and conviction? Neither side is right or wrong. It's all in the interpretation, something that happens frequently in this film. More than 40 years after its release, Patton remains a classic. The movie boasts excellent production value along with a stellar performance from its lead. War movies don't get much better than this. Patton appears in an aspect ratio of approximately 2.20:1 on this Blu-ray disc. Superficially, the movie looks very good, but superficially doesn't tell the whole story. The folks behind this transfer scrubbed the picture clean within an inch of its life. This meant a total lack of grain and a shiny, artificial appearance to much of the movie. This became evident during the movie's iconic opening sequence. When Patton stepped in front of the flag, Scott looked superimposed, like he'd been digitally inserted on a fake backdrop. The image almost took on a cartoony look at times and lacked the film-like feel it should have boasted. Which was a shame, as other aspects of the presentation showed clear improvements. Sharpness was usually quite strong, as only minimal softness appeared. Occasional wide shots could be mildly fuzzy, but those remained rare and not a real distraction. Jaggies and shimmering presentation no issues, and edge halos weren't a factor. The movie also came free from source flaws and was the cleanest I'd ever seen it. Colors looked fine. The movie came with a natural palette and seemed vivid and full. Blacks were deep and firm, while low-light shots seemed smooth. Were it not for the relentless, life-sapping use of noise reduction techniques, this could have been a great presentation. As it stands, the image seemed too shiny and plastic to satisfy as a good representation of the source. On the other hand, the DT's HDMA 5.1 was consistently pleasing for its age. The soundstage demonstrated surprising width and depth for such an old film. The stereo imaging of the front three channels appeared especially strong. Sounds were nicely placed within that area and they also panned well across the speakers. We even got a lot of accurately localized speech. The surrounds were used sparingly but somewhat effectively. They provided a decent level of ambience, though they rarely attempted more than that. This was fine with me, especially since the front spectrum was so vivid and well defined. Audio quality seemed perfectly solid for a movie from 1970. Speech demonstrated a bit of edginess, but the lines were intelligible and reasonably natural. Effects also suffered from a modicum of distortion, as explosions and gunfire occasionally became a little rough. I didn't think these issues were a real problem, though, as the elements were acceptably accurate. The score appeared pretty clean and smooth, and it featured nice dynamics. Ultimately, the sound mix of Patton was quite good for its age. How did this Blu-ray compare to the prior 2006 DVD? Audio was a bit peppier and more full, and visuals looked superior. Even with the compromises of the excessive noise reduction, the Blu-ray appeared better defined and more vivid than the flat, dull, soft DVD. I'm not happy with the Blu-ray's picture, but it was still better than the prior DVD. The Blu-ray includes all of the extras from the 2006 DVD. On disc 1, we find an introduction from screenwriter Francis Ford Coppola. He chats about challenges related to the Patton character, his research and choices, why he was fired from the production, and how its success helped his career. This 4-minute and 54-second chat acts as a decent little lead into the movie. Coppola also provides an audio commentary. He gives us a running, screen-specific look at the film. First, the bad news: this commentary comes with tons of dead air. This problem intensifies as the movie progresses and leaves us with an awful lot of empty spots. Coppola even acknowledges this. About 70 minutes in, he remarks that doing a commentary for a movie you didn't direct is like being the commentator for the Rose Parade. That's not fair, as I've heard plenty of good tracks from non-directors, as well as many lousy ones from directors. At least when Coppola does speak, he usually offers decent information. Coppola discusses how he ended up on the project, why he was canned, research, inspirations, and the methods he used to organize his sources. Coppola also goes over creating some of the flick's most famous sequences, like the opening speech, changes made by subsequent screenwriter Edmund North, and what parts of the film are real and which are invented. Coppola manages to present nice details, but the pervasiveness of the dead air makes it a tough listen. When we head to disc 2, we find a standard DVD that replicates the same platter from the 2006 DVD package. We start with history through the lens, Patton, a rebel revisited. This 90-minute and 4-second program mixes movie clips, archival materials, and interviews. We find notes from producers/former studio executives David Brown and Richard Zanuck, grandson Robert Patton, cinematographer Fred Koenikamp, aide to General Bradley Chet Hansen, military historian Cole Kingseed, and World War II veteran/author Paul Fussell. We also get some archival footage, most notably a TV appearance by Charles Cole, one of the soldiers whose abuse by Patton was depicted in the film. We even hear from Cool's dad as he reads a letter the kid sent to him about the incident. Rebel examines the extremely long period it took to bring Patton's story to the screen, adapting books about the general and dealing with the anti-war climate in the late 60s, finding a director and casting. From there we learn about locations, issues related to recreating a war, and other production topics as well as its reception and legacy. We find out about fact versus fiction and get biographical notes about Patton as well as some about General Omar Bradley and other figures. Those elements comprise the majority of Rebel, and they help distinguish it from the average making of program. Fans of the latter genre will get a fair amount of good information in that vein, but biography dominates Rebel. It examines Patton's life within the context of the movie, though, so expect a lot of information about how the two intersect. All of that makes it very compelling. I like the look at omissions from Patton's career such as the failed Hammelburg raid, and it's good to see events in a broader context. Rebel melds movie making of with standard biography to become a useful program. For the next documentary, we get the 46-minute and 35-second Patton's Ghost Corps. In it, we hear from veterans of Patton's unit who were left behind when he raced to fight the Battle of the Bulge. Recorded in 2004, we hear from SGT Harry Francisco, PFC Myron Albert, SSGT John Milroy, PFC Robert Porter, PFC Harry Helms, SGT Jack Kopitz, 1st LT Herndon Inga, PFC Bob Kingsbury, SGT Ralph Reichley, PFC Richard Kelly, SGT Earl Carpenter, SSGT James Carey, PFC Harold Kane, SGT Angelo Brucchito, PFC William Foley, SGT Bill Peck, PFC Russell Bryant, SGT Jack Weekly, SGT Fred Nichols, PFC Paul Hemingway, PFC Doug Benson, 1st LT Howard Rives, SGT Bill Heinlein, SGT Nicholas Viglian, PFC Don Mulry, PFC Oscar McLam, Chaplain Charles H. Manning, SGT Gilbert Kenyon, PFC Roland Slutter, Capt. William Hansel, PFC James Blount, Capt. Robert Castle, SGT Walter Turner and PFC Harry Kirsten. The show examines the events experienced by the soldiers. Left in a holding position, they confront a lack of supplies and a severe German winter. We learn about the Army Special Training Program, ASTP, its dismantling and what happened to its members. We follow their issues and experiences in detail. Corps proves quite blunt as it explores its subject. The soldiers tell their stories in detail and don't hide their emotions. We also get a lot of footage from the period, some of which shows graphic results of warfare. We find outspoken opinions of Patton as well as the ins and outs of the soldiers' lives. This ends up as a gripping piece of work. Disc 2 also contains a good 49-minute and 46-second documentary called The Making of Patton, a tribute to Franklin J. Schaffner. This piece effectively covers a fair amount of information about the making of the film, though the title is somewhat misleading. It makes it sound as though the program will be a biography of Schaffner, whereas it spends virtually no time discussing his life other than as it related to Patton. The piece provides modern interviews with cinematographer Fred Kroenekamp and composer Jerry Goldsmith. Their comments are combined with 1970 remarks from Schaffner, actor George C. Scott and others and are mixed in with production stills, on-set behind-the-scenes footage, and finished film clips. Overall it's a solid though too brief documentary. A film of this scope could have used more time than 50 minutes, but for what we get, it's well presented. Much valuable information about the film's creation is depicted and it maintains a generally entertaining pace. Under still galleries, we get two elements. Production still gallery accompanied by Jerry Goldsmith's complete musical score runs 36 minutes and 20 seconds. Is it just me, or does it seem surprising that the score for a nearly 3-hour movie takes up so little time? I guess that's because Goldsmith repeats so many motifs. Next comes a behind-the-scenes gallery accompanied by audio essay on the historical Patton. It lasts 53 minutes and 15 seconds as it presents notes from Patton historian Charles M. Province, the founder of the Patton Historical Society. Province's remarks are quite interesting and informative. He adds a lot of data that isn't covered by the film in that he tells us about Patton's life prior to World War II. Province also clarifies some of the events that are depicted in the film and tells us what really happened, though this doesn't happen much. It seems that the movie was pretty accurate. While I'm sure he worked from notes, it doesn't appear that Province is just reading his comments, which adds a nicely informal quality to his statements. The track offers some solid perspective on the historical Patton and whets one's appetite for a full biography. The disc concludes with the movie's original theatrical trailer. It also opens with a preview for Jumper. Compared to the original 1999 DVD, the Blu-ray set loses 4 radio ads from the prior disc as well as some alternate Goldsmith musical cues. Also absent are the newsreel clips of the real Patton that appeared on the first widescreen Laserdisc release, but not the 1997 reissue. I have no idea why these fascinating clips still don't make the cut. As it stands, Patton is one of the all-time great films, one that fully deserves its continued level of respect. It tells its tale well and benefits from many positive elements. The Blu-ray offers good audio and supplements, but the image suffers from too much noise reduction and comes with a shiny, artificial look. That's too bad. Patton remains a terrific movie that deserves better treatment than it receives here. I love it, God help me, I do love it. I love it more than my life. So speaks Gen. George S. Patton Jr. about war, in Patton. In his words we hear a premonition of the most memorable of all war movie speeches, Col. Kilgore's "I love the smell of napalm in the morning," from Apocalypse Now. It is surely no coincidence that both screenplays were co-written by Francis Ford Coppola. The Kilgore character seems like a screwball spin-off of Patton, a man who observes to his staff at the end of the war, all good things must come to an end. In his own eyes, Patton was larger than life and stood outside time. Standing on a North African battlefield where Carthage was attacked by Rome, he says I was here, and he means it. He believes in reincarnation and destiny, and when he is benched on the eve of the invasion of Europe, he rants, "The last great opportunity of a lifetime and I'm left out of it? God will not allow it to happen." That swagger was his strength and weakness. He could inspire men to heroic feats, he was a brilliant strategist, but he was a genius at getting himself into trouble. In a war where millions died horribly, he slapped a shell-shocked soldier and his career was derailed. Franklin J. Schaffner's Patton, 1970, released at the height of the unpopular war in Vietnam, was described by many reviewers at the time as really an anti-war film. It was nothing of the kind. It was a hard-line glorification of the military ethic, personified by a man whose flaws and eccentricities marginalized him in peacetime, but found the ideal theater in battle. In this he was not unlike Churchill. Both men used flamboyance, eccentricity, and a gift for self-publicity as a way of inspiring their followers and perplexing the enemy. That Patton was in some ways mad is not in doubt, at least to the makers of this film, but his accomplishments overshadowed, even humiliated, his cautious and sane British rival, Montgomery. The film is nearly 3 hours long and George C. Scott is on screen for most of that time, when we are not seeing battle scenes or Nazi planners, always speculating about Patton. It is one of those sublime performances in which the personalities of the actor and the character are fulfilled in one another. Although the role was offered to other actors who were bigger stars, critic Tim Dirks lists Burt Lancaster, Rod Steiger, Lee Marvin, Robert Mitchum, and John Wayne. It is unimaginable without Scott. His comic opera Gen. Buck Turgidson in Doctor Strangelove, 1963, informs more than a little of Patton's nuttiness and his hatred of the Russians. Scott, 1927 to 1999, was big, powerful, lonely, brilliant, a drinker, a perfectionist who stood so far outside Hollywood circles it was a foregone conclusion he would not turn up at the Academy Awards. In his career he sought out challenges like the plays of Shakespeare, O'Neill, and Miller, in the same way Patton hungered for battle. Like Patton, he was a man without a purpose when he was off stage. Consider the scene where Patton is dressed by his aide, who adjusts his helmet reverently on his head as if placing a crown. Patton regards himself in the mirror and muses to himself, "All my life I've wanted to lead a lot of men in a desperate battle." He could be an actor preparing to walk onto a stage. "General, the men don't always know when you're acting or not," a subordinate tells him after one flamboyant speech. "They don't need to know," Patton says. "Only I need to know." Headlines and newsreels personified armies by referring to their generals. Rommel was defeated in Africa, Patton swept north through France. Patton saw it the same way, and when he promises he will liberate Messines before Montgomery gets there, he is thinking in the first person. Gen. Omar Bradley, Karl Malden, who has the film's only other significant leading role, quails at the risk of lives and equipment that Patton is willing to contemplate, because he does not quite see that for Patton his men and equipment are the limbs of his ego. Vanity and courage found their intersection in Patton. "If you were named Admiral of the Turkish Navy," Bradley tells him, "I believe your aides could dip into their haversacks and come up with the appropriate decoration." Patton is not a war film so much as the story of a personality who has found the right role to play. Scott's theatricality is electrifying. As Patton he always stands up in his jeep, loves making speeches, grandstands, plunges into the action to personally goad his men, even directs traffic. There is a touch of the manic about him. He seems to have no personal life. The film makes no mention of family, children, even close friends. His heart-to-heart talks are with himself. He seems formidably well-read, lecturing his subordinates on the history of the battlefields, the lessons of Napoleon, the experiences of earlier leaders who came this way. He has a classical quotation for every occasion. "You son of a bitch," he gloats after outsmarting Rommel, "I read your book." Scott's performance is not one level but portrays a many-layered man who desires to appear one level. Instead of adding tiresome behavioral touches, he allows us small glimpses of what may be going on inside. Having made a fetish of bravery, he obtains a dog that is terrified most of the time, and affectionately drags the cowardly beast wherever he goes. Told by the press that the American public is fascinated by his pearl-handled revolver, he stone-faces, "Ivory. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans whorehouse would carry a pearl-handled revolver." That shows he's given it some thought. Early in the film, under surprise air attack by the Nazis, he stands in the middle of a street firing at them with the revolver. Crazy, yes, but it adds to the legend. The most famous scene is the first one, Patton mounting a stage to address his troops from in front of an American flag that fills the huge 70mm screen. His speech is unapologetically bloodthirsty, "We will cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks." His uniform and decorations, ribbons and medals, jodhpurs and riding boots and swagger stick fall just a hair short of what Groucho Marx might have worn. Scott's great nose could be the beak of an American eagle. The closing shot is the other side of the coin, a graying and lonely old man, walking his dog. Even then, we suspect, Patton is acting. But does he know it? Franklin Schaffner, 1920 to 1989, was a master of bold, uncluttered canvases. After a start directing live television in the 1950s, he made dramas, including The Best Man, one of the best Hollywood films about politics, before finding his natural footing with epics such as The Warlord, 1965, Planet of the Apes, 1968, and, after Patton, Nicholas and Alexandra, 1971, and Papillon, 1973. His Patton is one of the most uncluttered of war movies, devoid of side plots, colorful supporting characters and human interest. There are no individual soldiers whose adventures we follow, and the battle scenes are seen in long shot, not personalized. They have the sweep of Victorian canvases instead of the hand-to-hand intimacy of Platoon, Saving Private Ryan or We Were Soldiers. Even the Bradley character has no purpose other than to admonish, support and puzzle over Patton, to stand there and look at him. The movie sees the war as Patton saw it, as Patton's story. Well, it's one way of looking at it. Footnote: I see the war most vividly through the eyes of an old friend, the director Russ Meyer, who enlisted at 17 and believed, with Patton, it was the best thing that ever happened to him. Over the years he has talked about it endlessly, and I have a glimpse of Patton from Meyer. In the closing days of the war, when Meyer was a Signal Corps cameraman near the German lines in France, he was rooted from his bed in the middle of a night and ordered to join an unauthorized raid behind enemy lines to be led by Patton. The general had become convinced Hitler was making a secret visit to the front, and planned to capture him personally. We drove off into the night, Meyer recalls. Hitler wasn't there. We returned, and were warned to keep quiet about it. That was Patton for you. There is a moment early in Patton when George C. Scott stands alone on a North African battlefield the morning after the fighting has ended. The dead are everywhere. He surveys the carnage with something that is not quite horror and not quite satisfaction but something uncomfortably close to joy. He quotes Plutarch. He is, in that moment, exactly what the film has been telling us. He is a man who was born in the wrong century and knows it, and has never fully forgiven the world for that fact. That scene tells you more about General George S. Patton Jr. than any biography written about him, and it takes about 45 seconds. Franklin J. Schaffner directed this film with complete assurance, and Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North wrote it without a wasted scene. Neither of them tells you what to think. They just show you the man and step back. The film opens, famously, with Patton addressing his troops and us in front of an American flag so enormous it fills the entire screen. He is in full dress uniform, ribbons and medals stacked to his chin, pearl-handled revolvers at each hip. He tells us that Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. He uses language that was startling for 1970 and remains bracing today. The speech runs 6 minutes and there is not a frame of it to spare. By the time he finishes, we know the man. The rest of the film, all 2 hours and 52 minutes of it, is the proof of what we have been told. The story follows Patton through the North African campaign of 1943, through Sicily, through the run across France, through the Battle of the Bulge and into Germany. It is the story of one of the most brilliant and most difficult military commanders in American history, a man whose genius for armored warfare was matched only by his genius for making powerful enemies. He slaps a hospitalized soldier he accuses of cowardice and loses command of his army. He gives a speech implying that post-war governance should belong to the Americans and the British and not the Russians, and is removed from command again. He wins battles that his superiors would have been content to let grind on for months. He is, depending on who is watching him, a monster or a hero or both simultaneously. Scott's performance is one of the great ones. He refused the Academy Award for Best Actor on principle, he said, opposing the competitive nature of awards, and the Academy gave it to him anyway. Right call. What Scott does here is not impersonate Patton or channel him in the way actors talk about their process. He just becomes him. There is no visible effort, no moment where you catch him working. The performance has no seams. He simply is the man. Karl Malden plays General Omar Bradley with a quietness that earns its own respect. Bradley is the man who admires Patton, understands him, and keeps getting handed the wreckage. Malden is so steady in the role that his scenes with Scott turn into something you do not expect from a war film. Two men who genuinely like each other, deeply at odds about what the job actually demands. Neither one wins those arguments. What makes Patton endure is not the battle sequences, impressive as they are. It is the question the film refuses to answer: is this man admirable? He wins wars. He drives his soldiers past the point of human endurance and asks them to be grateful for it. He believes in reincarnation and is entirely serious about it. He is vain, profane, devout, brilliant, and occasionally monstrous. The film presents all of this without judgment and without the comfort of a verdict. Richard Nixon watched it repeatedly in the White House, reportedly transfixed. Whether he was inspired or warned is a question the film deliberately leaves open. That is why it still matters. We keep having the same argument about what we want from the people who lead us, whether results justify the damage, whether brilliance excuses cruelty, whether a man who wins by breaking every rule deserves the win. Patton does not settle that argument. It just puts the most extreme version of it on screen and runs it for nearly 3 hours. Richard Nixon watched it over and over at the White House, sometimes dragging Kissinger along. Nobody has ever fully explained what Nixon thought he was learning. That ambiguity is the film's greatest achievement. 55 years on, it still has not resolved. In early 1971, the Academy Awards saluted Patton. Capturing 8 Oscars including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Screenplay, Best Editing, and Best Production Design, the movie won every major battle of the evening. Such acclaim was richly deserved, for Patton remains to this day one of Hollywood's most compelling biographical war pictures. With its larger-than-life, yet at the same time singularly human, portrayal of Gen. George S. Patton, Jr., Franklin Schaffner's picture is an example of filmmaking at its finest. From production design and battle choreography to simple one-on-one dramatic acting, Patton has it all. There is no scene in all 170 minutes that doesn't work on some level. Patton was not a friendly, easygoing person. A war hero and a keen strategist, he was also harsh, stubborn to the point of intransigence, and undiplomatic. Aside from the campaigns he waged in North Africa, Sicily, and across Europe, the general is perhaps best remembered for an incident when he slapped an enlisted man. The news media of the time vilified him for this, and the history books have been little more kind. That single act, more than anything, typified the national perception of him. That side of the man is shown in Patton, but there are more facets to the general's personality than what he presented in public. There was also the deeply thoughtful philosopher, who believed in God and destiny, and accepted reincarnation. He believed that he had been on the battlefield when the Carthaginians fought the Romans, and had later served with Napoleon. Patton was neither cold nor insensitive. He cared deeply about those under his command who stood in the face of enemy fire and refused to yield. In its even-handed presentation, Patton does justice to those aspects of the general's character, in addition to the more obvious ones. What we see is not a legend, but a man, with all the flaws and triumphs that made him who he was. Into the role stepped George C. Scott, giving the performance of a long and impressive career. Indeed, Scott became so identified with the character, and played the general so perfectly, that the Patton of documentaries has since occasionally been referred to as an imposter. In a part that requires a skillful scaling of the emotional ladder, Scott finds the perfect balance between bombast and subtlety. From the opening scene, the famous speech to the Third Army in front of the giant American flag, the viewer's attention is riveted to the screen, and only when the final credits roll do external distractions reassert themselves. It is no exaggeration to say that, in the decade of the 70s, only men like Brando, Pacino, Nicholson, and De Niro equaled what Scott accomplished in Patton. The film opens in 1943 North Africa, with a brutal look at American casualties at the Battle of Kasserine. Patton arrives from Morocco to take command the U.S. Army in Tunisia in preparation for fighting Rommel, Karl Michael Vogler, at El Guitar. From North Africa, Patton's forces move to Sicily, where they sweep north across the island, taking Palermo, then racing Montgomery, Michael Bates, to Messina. Along the way, Patton's verbal and physical abuse of a soldier suffering from battle fatigue, which the general brands as cowardice, becomes ammunition for his critics. He later offers a public apology, but this incident keeps him from the action for a while, and he must stand by as a decoy during the Normandy invasion. Later in the year, however, General Omar Bradley, Karl Malden, gives Patton command of the Allied Third Army, with which he pushes across Western Europe to stop the Germans at the Battle of the Bulge, the last major Nazi offensive of the war. With the exception of Patton, the only character given more than cursory attention is Omar Bradley, who is shown to be a conservative, level-headed antithesis to Patton's impulsive, ill-tempered bluster. Bradley begins the film serving under Patton, and ends it as his superior. The two are friends, but each finds fault with the other's methods. As Bradley says, "I do this job because I've been trained to do it. You do it because you love it." The statement that Patton is his own worst enemy is proven repeatedly. After the slapping incident, while the general is essentially on probation, he makes some comments that he believes to be off the record. The press prints them, and Patton is seen as having insulted the Russian allies. By claiming that the United States and England would jointly rule occupied Europe following the war. In order to get back into favor with his superiors, Patton must promise to keep his big mouth shut. Patton manages the intricate task of presenting personal details in the larger context of their historical backdrop. We observe detailed recreations of the battles of El Guitar, Sicily, and the Bulge, even as Patton's own desires, needs, and hopes are exposed through his actions and conversations. The most defining moments for the general as a person often come when he's alone with his aide, or facing his own mortality as he gazes across battlefields that are millennia old. Fred Koenkamp's photography does justice to the picture's material. Not only does he have a good sense of how to capture a battle on film, but he is equally adept at framing the quieter, more personal moments. The last shot of the film, with Patton walking his dog across a snow-spotted field in Bavaria, blends the best of both these intimate and panoramic views. Jerry Goldsmith's fine, and immediately recognizable, score complements Koenkamp's cinematography. Those who have not seen Patton, or who have not watched the film carefully, might assume that this movie is about World War II and one of its most celebrated generals. In fact, they would be only partially correct. What Patton sets out to do is to demythicize its subject and show the forces that drove this man. Brilliant tactician, merciless disciplinarian, tireless fighter, prima donna, and staunch patriot, Patton was all of these things and more. Life for him was the battlefield, and without war, his spirit was sapped. The German military recognized this when they noted that Berlin's fall would finish him. Patton was an anachronism, a man who belonged in another time. He was a warrior living in a time when victory in battle no longer meant the triumph it once had, a Roman conqueror who understood the meaning of the words that all glory is fleeting. Above all, however, he was an icon whom millions cheered, millions hated, and few understood. One way you judge classic movies is by the parts that stick with you. By that measure, I've long regarded Patton as something of a mirage, a war movie about a personality and a larger-than-life actor who won the Oscar for bringing that personality to the screen, a picture of bravura moments and yet many duller command conference intrigues. Ask most people what they remember about this epic and they'll talk about the cussing, that opening pep talk in front of a gigantic American flag, a speech that apparently is based on what Third Army soldiers remembered of Patton's patented off-the-cuff get acquainted with the troops speech. Now I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. It's a blustering, sentimental and patriotic rhapsody in profanity. And when the movie was new, in 1970, that speech set a tone that was jarringly out of step with a country souring on the Vietnam War, cynical and more in the mood for M.A.S.H. and Kelly's Heroes than a John Wayne flag waver that went out of its way not to cast John Wayne in the lead. For a war movie, there are maybe half a dozen combat scenes, most quite brief. But director Franklin Schaffner, Planet of the Apes, Papillon, Islands in the Stream, The Boys from Brazil, limited himself to one big desert set-piece battle, filled with real tanks, real bombers, and fighters sweeping in low and a sea of extras dodging faked explosions under a sky littered with pyrotechnics department air bursts. You remember the music, that jaunty, Glorious March by Jerry Goldsmith. They titled the film Patton, Lust for Glory in Britain to sort of soften the harsh portrait the film paints of the brilliant British popinjay, Gen. Bernard Law Montgomery. The moment we hear that march in its full glory as Patton leads Third Army in a dash across France, the movie, and anybody who sees it forgets all about Monty, the hero of El Alamein. But towering over all of it in our memory is the eagle-beaked aggression of George C. Scott, one of the greatest screen actors this country has ever produced, a stunning presence so identified with the character that even historians have a hard time remembering what the real Patton looked or sounded like, if they're honest. Scott won the role after Robert Mitchum, Lee Marvin, Burt Lancaster, and Rod Steiger were considered and approached over the years as 20th Century Fox chief Darryl F. Zanuck, a WWI veteran who got himself into the thick of World War II action as an Army Signal Corps colonel, was eager to produce a combat epic to rival his big-budget, all-star D-Day account, The Longest Day. What seems timeliest about this 1970 release at this moment, in the middle of the latest attempt by Hollywood screenwriters to get decent pay, compensation commiserate with the many platforms their content now covers, is the writing. Francis Ford Coppola reworked material from many sources into a script that's mainly an eyewitness to Patton view of the famous general. The structure brilliantly uses the familiar device of letting us see his foe's view of the man through the German officer, Siegfried Rock, who researches and explains Patton, in German, with subtitles, to Generals Rommel and Jodl, Karl Michael Vogler, Richard Munch, and the viewer. Coppola peppers the dialogue with Pattonisms, profanity, sprinkling quotations from famous generals and historians in French and Latin. He plays up Patton's erudite, courtly side, his belief that he is reincarnated, a soldier who has fought in many wars over the millennia, making it his destiny to lead a great army in the greatest war of all. The soldiers lay naked in the sun. 2,000 years ago. I was here. The screenplay leans into the blood rivalry with Rommel and finds fun in the equally bitter but somehow playful one with Montgomery, who has been depicted in a few films, but whose memory has been replaced by the, appropriately, clipped, high-voiced barking of Michael Bates in this film. Coppola tapped into American Cold War/Vietnam War politics by reminding 1970 viewers of Patton's mistrust and disdain for the Russians. My compliments to the general. Please inform him that I do not care to drink with him or any other Russian son of a bitch. Patton's bellicose fetishizing of war as a human endeavor is meant to bathe some of the hero worship in blood, and it does. But America embraced Archie Bunker's intolerant form of patriotism as we laughed at it. Coppola has talked of being fired from this film. But when the finished product hit theaters, almost all of what was on the screen came from his pages, structure, research, and invention. And through it all Scott bellows, swaggers, rages and teases, all but devouring the screen, if never quite insecure enough to steal scenes from the likes of Oscar winner Karl Malden as the GI General, Omar Bradley. You can't watch Patton and not be utterly consumed with the title character, which almost works against the film. Scott went on to other larger-than-life characters, a version of Hemingway in Islands in the Stream for Schaffner, the best American-born Scrooge in Clive Donner's version of A Christmas Carol for TV. But Patton would overshadow them all. He'd even bring the character back for a less energetic Last Days of Patton TV movie years later. When TBS ran its Saturday AM series Movies for Guys Who Like Movies in the 80s and early 90s, Patton was on a regular rotation, with Die Hard, Kelly's Heroes and the Clint Eastwood westerns. Winner of 7 Academy Awards, it was one of the most honored films ever to make it into that butch, action-oriented program. And the reason isn't just Scott, and it isn't just the catchy Goldsmith score, Schaffner's skilled direction of the footage shot by Fred J. Koenikamp, and the brisk, for a 3-hour film, editing by Hugh Fowler. It's the script, started by many hands, crafted into something an actor at his best seething, or in full bellow, could sink his teeth into, that makes the series of movie accidents a lust for glory that lasts. The opening moments of Franklin J. Schaffner's Patton remain perhaps the most famous, and certainly its most commented on, a gigantic American flag fills the screen, and hubbub fills the soundtrack. An off-screen voice calls 10 Hut, and there's silence. Then General George S. Patton, George C. Scott, strides marches into view. He is far smaller, in Schaffner's framing, than we might expect for such a larger-than-life figure. Old Glory, though, is absurdly big, and many writers compare the effect to pop art in its assertive simplicity. There's a bugle and a salute from Patton, then a medium-long shot of him is followed by a peculiar extreme close-up which shows nearly all of his saluting hand, but only a quarter of his face. Perhaps this is an indication of how difficult it will be to get to know the man behind the soldier. Schaffner now cuts to Patton's other hand, gripping his swagger stick, and then we see his medals, his pistol, his helmet insignia, all the accoutrements of his military role, but still very little to suggest there is anything here but a soldier. No emotion, no words until he begins his celebrated speech, delivered in real life, but rewritten for the film by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North. I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. The scene tells us everything we need to know, or does it? Certainly, it encapsulates one view of Patton, the forthright, uncompromising soldier dedicated to the pursuit of victory. And it has become so associated with Patton, as indeed has Scott's performance, that when Joseph Sargent's MacArthur, 1977, opens with a flag and a speech from Gregory Peck as the titular general, or when Tom Cruise addresses his troops in front of the Stars and Stripes in Top Gun, Maverick, 2022, we're surely intended to think straight away of this moment. But if the Patton we see in the scene is supremely confident in his abilities and his rightness, Patton the movie is not, or at least not all the time. It would be utterly wrong to think of it as revisionist, or specifically anti-war, because it certainly is a celebration of the real Patton. But it would be equally wrong to see it as hagiography. While it is not overtly critical of Patton's worldview, it does not exclude others either. Patton isn't unsympathetic, but nor is he quite sympathetic, let alone a conventional hero. He's driven, obsessive, and slightly weird. His misjudgments, and the way that he was sidelined more than he would have liked in some of World War I's major military actions, are in many ways the focus of the film more than his achievements. Patton may present its subject as a great man in some ways, but decidedly not in the sense of the great man theory of history. Given Patton's relatively large budget and its subject matter, audiences in 1970 might have expected another war epic like The Longest Day, 1962, and indeed 20th Century Fox's Darryl F. Zanuck was instrumental in having both films made. But what they got was something much more like David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia, 1962, a movie where the lavish spectacle of war is there only as a context for a much more personal portrait of a complicated man. As with Lawrence, we are left with as many questions as answers, and as with Lawrence, an immensely long film, about 3 hours apiece, though Lawrence is slightly longer than Patton, is held together by one of the greatest biographical screen performances ever. After Patton's opening speech, the scene changes to Tunisia in 1943, and a defeat for the Allies. Dead men and animals litter the dust, a scorpion crawls over a scorched body by a burned-out vehicle, scavengers roam. It's a far cry from the lofty exhortations of the speech. Are we already getting the sense that Patton's ideals and reality don't quite match up, and tellingly the officer we now meet, contemplating the carnage, is not Patton himself but General Omar N. Bradley, Karl Malden. He'll be the second most important character in the movie after Scott's Patton. Tellingly, too, after depicting Bradley at the battlefield, the film moves to showing Patton in Morocco, inspecting troops in parade dress far from the front line, though he protests that "I'd prefer to be in Tunisia fighting the Germans." A Moroccan government minister, Albert Dumayrtir, presents Patton with a medal and remarks that the lions in their dens tremble at his approach, a comment which must be intended to come across as ironic to the viewer even if not meant as such by the character. Given a command in North Africa, Patton soon asserts the strict discipline that will be one of his hallmarks and his eventual partial undoing. He also comes, quite soon, to develop a rivalry with the British general, later Field Marshal, Bernard Montgomery, Michael Bates, which is possibly exacerbated by a more general Anglophobia and persists through the invasions of Sicily in 1943 and France in 1944. While this is vexatious for Patton, however, his career is more seriously derailed by an incident in 1943 where he slaps a soldier suffering from combat fatigue. In fact, there were two such incidents, trimmed to one for the film. This and the subsequent apology that Patton is forced to make to his men are important turning points in the film as story elements to Patton's superiors. They were further evidence that he could be a loose cannon, and he was given some frustratingly minor assignments thereafter. But they are vital, too, in illuminating a central aspect of his character. In Patton's formative years, what later became known as shell shock and then combat fatigue, what today we call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, had often been regarded simply as cowardice, and although by the time of World War II the US military was far more enlightened on the subject, Patton is incapable of moving with the times. Battle fatigue, he says, is a free ride for yellow bellies. Just as with T.E. Lawrence, we have a strong sense that Patton is never really going to be happy because he's living in the wrong place and time. He believed, quite literally, in reincarnation and that he had fought in battles of the past. The general's biographer Carlo Dest, in 1995's A Genius for War, suggests that he saw himself as a modern version of the American Civil War's Confederates. Although Patton himself did not come from the South, one of his grandparents had been a Confederate colonel. He was fascinated by the idea of dying in battle, Dest suggests. One of the German characters that appear briefly in the movie, Captain Steiger, Siegfried Rock, describes him as a 16th century man. He is depicted by Schaffner and Scott as proud and ambitious, intolerant of weakness and excessively preoccupied with appearance, but he is not just the ramrod straight general of stereotype, he's insecure at the same time as being self-assured, and emotional on occasions. In short, though he is highly intelligent and articulate, he is thoroughly out of place in the rational, technocratic, media-aware army of the 20th century. The writers of Patton develop the general's character carefully through individual episodes revealing different facets of his nature, occasionally with a little humor. But a great deal of the credit for creating him must go to Scott in a performance that, as Dest points out, for many people has become the enduring image of the real Patton. It is Scott's face we think of when we see the general's name, Scott's growly delivery, and not Patton's rather high-pitched voice, in which we imagine him speaking. Many others, including John Wayne and Burt Lancaster, had been offered the part, and Lancaster might have been pretty good at it, but it's difficult to believe anyone could have done better than Scott. It is surely his greatest screen performance and one he was made for. Superficially you might occasionally be reminded of the crazed general in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, 1964, but the character whom Scott's Patton really resembles is the strictly religious Midwestern father in Paul Schrader's Hardcore, 1979, a complete fish out of water as he navigates the West Coast sex industry. He is nothing like Patton on paper, of course, but his underlying responses to the situations in which he finds himself may not be so different. Though nearly all attention goes to Scott, Malden, also billed above the title, delivers an almost equally fine performance of understated conviction, very unfairly denigrated by some critics as Bradley, who is initially Patton's junior but later promoted over him, and who is his utter opposite, quiet, bespectacled, genial, devoid of braggadocio even when he is being assertive, seemingly determined to make himself unobtrusive most of the time while Patton demands the limelight. Malden's Bradley is credible, hinting just to the right degree at inner strengths. For all his seeming modesty he is no pushover. Bradley also consulted on the film, which is partially based on the first of his two memoirs. Scott reprised his role for the made-for-TV sequel The Last Days of Patton, 1986, rather disconcertingly because, after the predictable opening flag, the action takes place only months later, yet Scott of course is almost 2 decades older. This does, in fact, make him more or less the correct age to play the Patton of the immediate post-war period when Last Days is set, but his performance in the original Patton is so unforgettable that he seems far too old by comparison in the sequel. Ron Burglass, meanwhile, plays the much younger, early 20th century Patton in flashback scenes which seem rather like padding. At first, The Last Days of Patton has some interest, concentrating on Patton's arguments with his superiors about the denazification of Germany. He argues that if those civil servants who had only paid lip service to the Nazi regime are all fired, there will be no Germans left to run the country, and Delbert Mann's directorial flair brings many scenes alive. But the story of Patton's car accident in 1945 and his subsequent death is not intrinsically interesting. It's an anticlimactically mundane end for such a legendary man, and the film spends far too long on it. The crash is also the subject of Brass Target, 1978, which puts it at the center of a conspiracy. I've not been able to see that film, although the casting of George Kennedy as Patton is certainly promising. Another big star, Kirk Douglas, took the part of Patton for René Clements' Paris Burning, 1966, where Glenn Ford played Bradley in an even smaller cameo. But neither makes much impact. Gert Frobe as the German military governor of Paris, torn between following orders and humane good sense, is by far the film's standout, and again there is an age problem, though Douglas in Is Paris Burning was actually closer to Patton's age than Scott was in Patton. He simply looks too young. In lauding Scott we should not, of course, forget that Patton is also a Schaffner film, and for that matter a Francis Ford Coppola one. Coppola had been hired to work on it in 1965, around the same time as he was co-writing Is Paris Burning, and it then went through multiple rewrites before Scott insisted on reinstating Coppola's work. He shared the writing credit with North, but ideas that would later interest Coppola in his own films can be detected quite clearly here. There are obvious linkages between the old-school Patton and Marlon Brando's Don Vito Corleone in The Godfather, 1972, for example, a film where Schaffner also worked on the screenplay, while Brando's Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, 1979, is a kind of nightmare Patton. The general's idiosyncrasies might have something in common with those of the inventor played by Jeff Bridges in Tucker, The Man and His Dream, 1988, while the aesthetic of the disastrously bad Megalopolis, 2024, and its intermeshing of past and present would surely have appealed to both the historian and the orator in Patton. Where Schaffner is concerned, the similarities between Patton and his other films are not as immediately apparent, but they are there. It is a stretch to say that there is a recognizable Schaffner style or a Schaffner kind of film. He's not an auteur in that sense, and indeed critic Pauline Kael thought him the kind of plain, literal-minded director who inherently lacked much of a signature. But there are certainly threads that connect many of his movies. The original Planet of the Apes, 1968, is probably his most famous, but it's Nicholas and Alexandra, 1971, The Boys from Brazil, 1978, and Papillon, 1973, that have the strongest resemblances to Patton, most notably in that they are all dominated by male characters in institutional or organizational settings, and, in rather different ways, deal with the past and the passage of time. All these traits also apply to The Godfather, while his jury room drama 12 Angry Men for TV in 1954 is yet another exploration of male characters in a highly rule-based setting. Perhaps the similarities are most obvious in the case of Nicholas and Alexandra, Schaffner's film about Russia's last royal rulers. Both this and Patton are long movies of around 3 hours telling stories that span a long period in distinct episodes. Both feature a proud and unbending leader. Both are built around big set pieces interspersed with smaller scale scenes. In both, there is care taken to cast actors who bear some resemblance to their historical characters, for example Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky in Nicholas and Alexandra, as well as Nicholas himself. Compare Bradley, Montgomery, and Patton himself in the 1970 movie. The history lessons, for instance a conversation between Lenin and Trotsky, may be a bit more blatant in Nicholas and Alexandra, but there is also a striking thematic link. the Queen Mother in that film calls Russia an 18th century country in a 20th century world, while the German officer Steiger describes Patton as a romantic warrior lost in contemporary times. When Nicholas says of his people they're children and they need a Tsar, they need tradition, he could easily be Patton speaking of his soldiers. The same idea of an old way of life trying to exist in a new reality is also key to The Boys from Brazil, based on Ira Levin's novel about a group of ex-Nazis striving to regenerate the Third Reich. Here, as well, there is a resemblance between the characters of Manschel, played by Gregory Peck, and Patton, both vain men, to some extent, renegades, living in the past, leading by fear, as does the Tsar Nicholas, and working for organizations which turn against them. Like Patton, The Boys from Brazil also features multiple international settings, makes much of local color, in this case Paraguay, and injects comic moments, between Laurence Oliver's Nazi hunter Lieberman and his landlord, into an otherwise serious story. In Papillon, Schaffner's adaptation of Henri Charrier's French prison memoir, the similarities might seem fewer, but leaving the very different subject matter aside, it's easy to detect many of the same directorial interests again: the male milieu, the local color, the humor, e.g. the crocodile catching scene. It could also be considered that, while Papillon and The Boys from Brazil appear to have two protagonists apiece and Patton only one, the character of Bradley is in many ways more than just support, and as important to the story as Patton himself. Patton is at least partly a study in contrasting approaches to leadership. Kael, for all her criticism of Schaffner, does acknowledge that he is capable of handling grand spectacle, and that is certainly on display in Patton in the relatively small amount of screen time that depicts the war being fought. But Schaffner is also intensely attentive to detail, something that's easy to overlook when Scott is so consistently dominant and attention-grabbing. Shots are carefully constructed. See, for example, the complex use of light and shadow in the scene about 18 minutes in, where Patton's followed down a corridor by two soldiers, or the imagery of military vehicles in the desert dusk. Bigger scenes are often expertly choreographed, for example, the clash of two military bands at Messina in Sicily, or the beautifully filmed Moroccan parade ground scene, where the color and order contrasts tellingly with the faded chaos we've just witnessed on the Tunisian battle site. Jerry Goldsmith's musical score also helps to tie together the long film. It's essentially conservative Hollywood music and quite heavily reliant on military motifs, but it's much superior to his overdone music for MacArthur, or for that matter Alan Ferguson's bombastic score for The Last Days of Patton, which nearly ruins some sequences. Patton won 7 Academy Awards, including the Best Picture accolade, as well as statuettes for Schaffner, for the screenwriters, and for Scott, although Scott refused his Best Actor award, calling the Oscars a meat parade. It also won for art direction, editing, and sound, while Goldsmith was nominated for his music, Fred J. Koenekamp for his cinematography, and Alex Weldon for special effects. In the US, it was the year's 4th highest grossing film, slightly behind Robert Altman's MAS*H, 1970, with which it was re-released a little later on a double bill. That combination may seem bizarre, given the two films' wildly different approaches to the subjects of war and the army, but remarkably Patton seemed to be appreciated by hawks and doves alike. Supporters of the military saw Patton as a hero, the anti-war, and there were plenty of them in 1970, with Vietnam raging, saw Schaffner's film as confirmation of their worst fears about intransigence at the highest levels of command. One critic at the time, A.D. Murphy of Variety, pinpointed the source of this appeal: Patton is one hell of a war picture, perhaps one of the most remarkable of its type ever made, which forges a daring and very successful path between cliché heroics and more contemporary put-down. Other critical views were more mixed. Vincent Canby in the New York Times found it consistently fascinating but felt it idolized Patton too much. Kael thought it simply copped out by not offering us enough information on which to base a judgment of the character. Were his eccentricities and his high opinion of himself justified? Roger Ebert described it as one of the most uncluttered of war movies, devoid of side plots, colorful supporting characters and human interest, but didn't see this as entirely positive. Unlike some of the critics, President Nixon was a huge fan, seeing Patton at least 6 times, and no doubt identifying with the hard done by general as well as with the invocation of the American spirit. It would be no surprise if Patton resonated with President Trump, too. The very thought of losing is hateful to Americans, says the general. This is one aspect of the film that can seem extremely hawkish, more so than other war movies, which tend to at least cursorily acknowledge the tragedy and destructiveness of war before they get on with the exciting blowing stuff up bits. For Patton's title character, it's all about winning. But Patton isn't necessarily saying that the general was right about this. The film is much less adulatory about Patton himself than its reputation might suggest. Sure, there's a little affection in the way he is presented, but nothing approaching unqualified praise. As Variety's Murphy observed, it's perfectly possible to see Patton as a chronicle of flaws if that's what you want to see. And is it a war movie in the normal sense at all, anyway? Maybe not. Of course, war is its setting, but there is very little actual combat insofar as the war itself is the topic. Patton is more about strategy, and even more than that it is about personality. It is the story of a man who finds that the values of his world are changing around him, and who's unwilling to change himself, but who still wants to make a difference on his own terms. Of the subtitles given to the movie for different releases, Lust for Glory sums it up better than Salute to a Rebel. If it were not based on a real person who happened to be a general, it could very easily be set just as effectively in a milieu of politics or business, for example. Is it an epic? It's certainly epic in length, but again, the large-scale, cast of thousand scenes are not the really important ones, and arguably, if Patton has a major flaw, it's that Schaffner and the writers haven't quite figured out how to combine these with the much smaller scale, more personal scenes where the real drama unfolds. But one thing it never is, not for a single moment, is boring. And once again, this has much more to do with its portrayal of Patton, the man, than with its depiction of war. Scott's magnetic performance, as well as Malden's sometimes underrated one, are the keys to the film's endless repeat value. It's aged far better than many films of its time, too, perhaps because it was already set in the past and makes no overt attempt to draw parallels between the 1940s and 1970, though again, they can be detected if you want them to be there. It still feels fresh. Schaffner's direction is occasionally flamboyant, as in that opening scene, of course, but more often quietly competent. Like Coppola's writing, too much flashiness would get tiresome over 3 hours. And it isn't needed when Scott and the character he plays come across so powerfully in one of the most engrossing screen biographies ever made. Patton is about following orders. Doing what you are told. Being pushed. Becoming better. When you follow orders, you win. The strongest point the film makes is in favor of the institution. In Patton, nothing is greater. The general respects it. He's just a bit of a rebel, that is his undoing. Is he right? Probably, but only in the most dangerous way. Turn the Nazi army around and fight the Russians with them. He accepts the consequences of his outspokenness as a good soldier should. And here we have the ultimate movie for 1970 and a cinematic sea change. The rebel who just might have known better than the politicians, but wouldn't quite go that far. Were this film made in 1950, that would not be an extraordinary theme. For 1970, it is the most famous last stand against a pop culture revolution that irreversibly changed the arts and Americans' way of life. Patton, like its protagonist, was chosen by history, not the other way around. Cinematic and music historians will point to a time span, roughly 1965-75, where America noticeably changed. Some will suggest the JFK assassination, the Beatles, or even Elvis as the beginning. Others contend Watergate or the end of the draft or the election of Ronald Reagan were the true end. This was no statistical change, but an emotional one. How we felt about things. Patton, according to the Internet Movie Database, opened nationally April 2, 1970. What was sayable, showable, allowable in the years around its release was changing forever. Observers will point to 1967 as sort of the beginning of New Hollywood, ushered in by Bonnie and Clyde and others. Patton was a revival of old school, a tribute to those pining for America's past in the midst of a turbulent, irreverent present. Almost every film that has followed, as well as some beforehand, smashes those barriers. Examples too countless to list. The Hollywood landscape, but consider some notable Oscar entries. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Institution is Leading to Failure, All the President's Men, Can't Trust the Folks at the Top, The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now and Platoon, No Glory in War, Only Hell, A Few Good Men, The Military is Corrupt, Unforgiven, There's Serious Ambiguity Between Right and Wrong, Good Will Hunting, People Should Not Be Pushed, but Nurtured. Patton defies those notions but is more sympathetic than it lets on. In the end, we have to obey authority. But in rebellion, there is glory. According to the IMDb, Patton was known internationally by assorted other titles, including Patton Rebel in Uniform, Patton, A Salute to a Rebel, Patton, Salute to Glory. Rebellion makes the movie far more than a conventional biopic. Patton succeeds where many other lauded efforts, Ray, Walk the Line, have not. This movie is about a larger-than-life character in one particular field, military service, that would soon cease to produce any more larger-than-life characters. This is not about a successful leader in a successful campaign, this is about the end of the generalissimo, an archetype that dominated human civilization since its inception. Patton is the perfect individual to deliver this story. It can and should be noted that Douglas MacArthur is an even stronger candidate. He was fired by the president several years after Patton had died. He famously declared in war, "There is no substitute for victory." But Patton believed in reincarnation and saw himself as the continuation of a long line of noble warriors. He speaks of ancient battle sites as though he were there, because he believes that he was. Thus we have a protagonist who not only ideally represents the archetype, but is well aware that he does. Those of us who grew up after Korea, or at least after Vietnam, have never witnessed a Patton and never will. Today's military operations by the major world powers are generally fought not over survival, but sanctions, principles, Geneva Conventions, international rules and guidelines. And so those who run them at the top are generally bureaucrats, technocrats, diplomats, even on some level humanitarians, who must meet a rapidly increasing moral/sensitivity criteria in each engagement. Patton, like great conquerors of centuries past, fights for survival and glory, but more of the former than the latter, as he eloquently declares in his powerful final statement. He casually walks through active battlefields, well before Col. Kilgore of Apocalypse Now. He carries a pistol, and uses it, and wears black gloves, probably the second most famous movie character to wear black gloves after Darth Vader. In private, we see another Patton, a scholarly type with owl-like glasses who designs his own appealing uniforms. He prays on his knees and reads the Bible every day. There is a statement being made in Patton's hospitality. The movie opens at the site of an American defeat in Morocco, and Patton's quarters are sparse and lightly defended, as is realized when German planes strafe the building during dinner. Gradually, as he begins ringing up victories and advancing through Sicily, Patton's headquarters come to resemble a palace, up until his ouster as 7th Army Chief. Everywhere he goes, the local reaction for him is enormous. The liberator has arrived and the people adore him. Despite the ugliness of war, Patton's world is bright. The sun shines on North Africa and Sicily even as the bombs fall. This is a gladiator on the path to glory. The battle scenes are not extraordinary and not nearly gritty enough for today's audience. The typical wounded soldier has a bandage around his head. This is a tough business, but these are winners. Patton in several ways connects with his foot soldiers. But clearly there is hubris. He surrounds himself with aides who shower him with praise. When his commanders object to his plans, he warns them they can either obey, or be replaced. The conflict in Patton is not so much with the Axis powers, but with his own rivals among the Allies for publicity. It is strongly implied that Patton makes important decisions to serve his own propaganda interests rather than the best interests of the Allies. But it is also strongly implied that bureaucracy risks undermining the American cause, that too many significant favors are granted to Montgomery and later the Russians to avoid ruffling feathers. Patton is doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. Patton reminds us, as does Shane, of an advanced society's tenuous relationship with warriors. Shane is needed to safeguard a community that does not welcome gunfighters. Patton is needed to win a world war by a society that will not let him slap his soldiers, by leaders and civilians who themselves may not be capable of ordering thousands of young men into dangerous but necessary battle zones with a clear conscience, knowing many of them are never going home. Karl Malden's depiction of Omar Bradley is one of the all-time great supporting roles. Here is the technocrat, highly competent, playing it by the book, the understudy to the warrior, and as America's military role in the world evolves rapidly between 1941 and 1945, he is the one who emerges most in demand, a consensus builder who will fight based on the rapidly evolving modern standards. At one point he tells Patton, "I do this because I've been trained to do it, you do it because you love it." A friend insists Patton has a serious problem in that the best part is the first 5 minutes. He has a point. One can just imagine the troops listening to the general before an incursion, perhaps D-Day, chills running down their spines. But the intro is not a pep talk, it's more like a worldview. Winners die, but they do not sacrifice. The goal and satisfaction is not to fight, but to win. Those captivated by the opening scene might assume Patton motivated soldiers through great speeches. In fact, his speech-making was not considered great. And what the movie gradually illustrates, beautifully, is the success of relentless pushing, how human beings, ironically, accomplish great things when they don't necessarily want to. We see armies that are forced to advance with no sleep against ruthless opposition. Even during relaxed moments after victories, they are disciplined if they stray from extremely rigorous eating schedules or dress codes. There is a natural human reaction to rebel against such directives that are considered unusual. Few are happy to be told by their boss that they must work an extra half hour every night to perform another task. What does not occur to them initially, and may never occur to them at all, is how this extra effort makes them better employees and their companies stronger. Bosses who make such demands take a risk if they are ineffective leaders, they are hated and seen as sadistic. An opposing example exists in Good Will Hunting, the Matt Damon vehicle that is also reviewed on this site. In Hunting, two professors nearly come to blows over whether a young genius should be pushed to expand his intelligence capabilities. The two films are a fascinating study in contrasts and generations. People in General Patton's world would look down on Will, a massive underachiever dependent on fragile psychotherapy. The viewpoint of Hunting is that life's abuses cause deep-rooted harm, that they cannot or should not be shrugged off for the sake of objective goals. In his opening speech, Patton tells his troops, 30 years from now, when you're sitting around your fireside with your grandson on your knee and he asks you, "What did you do in the Great World War II?" you won't have to say, "Well, one shoveled S in Louisiana." What did General George Patton do? The standard answer is defeated the Nazis in Africa and Europe, but the deeper answer is, some of the toughest, most effective military campaigns ever experienced. Just as we see Patton's relentless drive outperforming his peers and more importantly, defeating the German army, we see the evolving standards of Western society eclipsing Patton. The greatest warrior of the European theater is defeating history's most legendary opponent, the Nazis, but is not leading the charge into Berlin. That assignment is gradually handed to more methodical, standardized figures Bradley and Eisenhower. The interest in Patton's services wanes the closer he gets to the capital. After the guns are silenced, he is deemed an outright liability, a serious risk to the newfound, highly uncertain balance of power in the world. A little of that can be shown well visually, specifically his standoffishness at the Soviet dance. but it's an otherwise difficult concept to illustrate, so the movie relies on face-to-face chats and messages. They will not send him to the Pacific, where an epic struggle still rages. And so he knows his day is over, that he has likely fought in history's last conventional world war, and incredibly, dies just a few months later after a routine traffic accident in which his fellow passengers were unhurt and the Jeep itself was repaired and reused. Patton was made at the height of American involvement in the Vietnam War and was probably applauded by those of pro-military sentiment disheartened by the backlash during Vietnam. In the years following the Vietnam War, cinema has re-embraced the war hero in pictures such as Saving Private Ryan and Letters from Iwo Jima, although those films and the modern genre also carry profound social and humanitarian concerns rarely evident in Patton. The general declares, in his stunning closing line, "Glory is fleeting." It is stunning not just for its accuracy, but misperception. Patton, of all people, underestimates the magnitude of the victory his soldiers produced. They did not wear neckties and go sleepless to deliver a conqueror to the streets of Europe. They did it to deliver from tyranny a safe, free Europe and beyond, whose glory is very much appreciated today. It wasn't a conventional war film, Francis Ford Coppola understates early in the new commentary track on this 2-disc edition, the third and best DVD release of Patton, 1970. At around age 27, he tells us, he was this Fox biopic's original screenwriter. His goal, to portray the essence of an unconventional, controversial World War II general as a model for those who chose to see that kind of hawkish military man as a kind of hero. But that was only half of it. Simultaneously, for moviegoers on the left side of the aisle, he aimed to depict Patton as a complex, tragic figure, a Don Quixote tilting at windmills at a time when warriors and warriors' values were no longer quite treasured. But Coppola's audacious opening scene with pistol packing, rough-talking General George S. Patton addressing the audience as though they were troops, backdropped by a vast American flag, was deemed so strange that, Coppola says, he was fired from the project. The film itself was to all appearances abandoned. Years later, in 1971, Coppola was close to getting fired again, this time as The Godfather's director. However, as chance would have it, Patton, which had been restarted and shot without him, had just taken 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Screenplay. Although years had passed since he turned in his initial, rejected script, there on that year's Oscar sweeper glowed his byline, shared with Edmund H. North, who worked directly with the production. After that, what studio could fire him and not look foolish in Variety? It's a resurrection story that he credits for saving his professional bacon and, we infer, The Godfather as we know it. Now, his commentary track here won't go on anyone's list of great audio exegeses. It's intermittent and repetitive, and his assumed audience seems to be all you young people in a film 101 class. But after 40 years, this 5-time Oscar-winning director, producer, and screenwriter is parent proud that so many of his early contributions, most famously the opening scene, survived in Patton. That byline story sparks a theme he returns to occasionally, his hindsight, at 67, into how much we are shaped by serendipity and happenstance. It's a prescient theme the younger Coppola wove into this epic-sized portrait of a man who believed himself fated to shape battlefields and therefore history. Of course, what's most memorable about Patton is George C. Scott's career-defining performance. More eagle-faced and gravel-voiced than the real Patton, Scott finds all the balancing points in a paradoxical character, one too easily caricatured as either a right-wing brute or a romanticized warrior hero. A poet, historian, and devoutly religious, Patton could be goddamn arrogant and abrasive, then moved profoundly by the death of a common soldier near him. He was pious and profane all at once, and a theatrical megalomaniac. Above all, he was a magnificent military tactician that the film suggests almost spiritually was the right man at exactly the right time. Patton's belief in his own reincarnation, his confidence that he was destiny's eternal soldier born repeatedly throughout time for the grandeur of war, which he lauded as mankind's noblest endeavor, is so hauntingly realized in the film that we have little cause to doubt his memories of the age-old strife in ancient Carthage, Greece, and Napoleon's Moscow campaign. Those battle horn triplets we hear punctuating Jerry Goldsmith's stirring score echo not just across battlegrounds, but down the centuries. Early on, a German intelligence officer, created by Coppola as a rather obvious conveyor of exposition, tells German Field Marshal Rommel that Patton is a man displaced in time, a 16th-century romantic out of his natural element in the modern world. Patton himself says that he loves war more than my life. But oh, his disdain for the 20th century, where mechanized infantry and wholesale destruction made it increasingly difficult for combat soldiers to prove their valor in combat. Patton bridges both sides of this partisan chasm. We understand, even if reluctantly, how Americans can reverentially glorify war in its pageantry and world-changing achievement. Yet this movie from the Vietnam era doesn't shirk the comprehension that so much of what Patton represented was fading in 1944 and is gone forever now. Its position is that World War II's reputation as the last good war was, and likely shall remain, secure. Reflecting the nation's growing war weariness, Patton's box office success in 1970 was bested by few films, but MAS*H was one of them. Rather than minimize them, Patton illuminates its subject's built-in and irresolvable ambiguities. Fittingly, director Franklin J. Schaffner, plus a Hannibal's army of second-unit directors, cast, and crew, stratified all this across the scope and scale of 73 European and North African locations, on sets measured in terrain geography rather than in board feet. A massive battle against Rommel's tank forces in Africa arrives blasting across every widescreen inch of the film's spectacular cinematography. And that's only a warm-up for the U.S. Third Army's exhausted drive through mud and snow across Europe, climaxing in the Battle of the Bulge. The 3 hours of screen time, this DVD restores the intermission, are episodic, but they give the battle sequences room they need alongside Patton's rise from 2 to 4-star status, his strategy sessions, and his relationships with his fellow officers, particularly Simple Soldier General Omar Bradley, played by dogface Karl Malden. Threaded throughout the choppy narrative are his personal, political, and professional missteps and controversies that embarrassed his superiors and nearly cost him full participation in history's largest war. There's an impressive amount of research and authenticity on display for what could have been just another Nazi bust-in action drama. Much of Scott's dialogue is lifted from Patton's actual words. Still, the film required some noticeable historical omissions. The real Patton's reputation as a vocal anti-Semite is, understandably, left out entirely. Likewise, Patton conforms to 1970s idea of PG-rated entertainment, so the general's famous foul mouth is by modern standards positively avuncular rather than shocking. While Patton avoided the genre's traditional easy jingoism, often the people and events surrounding Scott exist chiefly to place him into unnecessarily greater relief. For instance, Patton's allied competitor across Europe, Britain's Field Marshal Montgomery, is portrayed one step away from any of Monty Python's adenoidal twits. Wherever Patton is arguably flawed, it's typically any scene where everything that isn't George C. Scott flattens into the background of his 3D presence. His is the only notable performance, and offhand we think back to Orson Welles' Charles Foster Kane for another example of an actor so dominating a Hollywood film. So be it. George Patton was born, at least once, for these big screen dimensions. By the end of the movie you may hate the half-crazed son of a bitch, but you can't not admire him. And in Scott we get a rare example of a Best Actor Oscar win that's unassailable. Well, unassailable except to Scott himself. Because he considered actors competing against one another unseemly, he refused the Oscar. During the ceremony he stayed home and watched a hockey game. If Fox had not fired that audacious young Coppola and backburnered Patton for a while, it's likely that the role would have gone to the studio's original choice, Burt Lancaster. Serendipity and happenstance. Released at the height of an unpopular war in Vietnam, Patton is a powerful cinematic contemplation on the incredible, albeit controversial, Legacy of General George S. Patton. The script was written by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North, based on Patton, Ordeal and Triumph by Lottie S. L. Farrago and General Bradley's memoir entitled A Soldier's Story. George C. Scott delivers one of the great performances in all of Hollywood history as General George S. Patton, old blood and guts, the gruff, recalcitrant, disciplined, well-read, profane yet virtuous Allied leader. Apparently the role was offered to numerous other leading men such as Burt Lancaster, Rod Steiger, Lee Marvin, Robert Mitchum, and John Wayne, but it is impossible to imagine anyone else besides George C. Scott filling these shoes. Scott was a billowing tower of a man, a drinker, a Shakespearean actor who tread uncomfortably through the circles of Hollywood, and so he predictably refused to attend the Academy Awards ceremony in which Patton won him Best Actor as well as the coveted Best Picture award. He refused to accept the award on philosophical grounds. There are so many famous scenes in this movie, images of a triumphant war hero, to a dejected aging veteran. The most famous shot is the opening scene which features General Patton addressing an unspecified band of American troops before a giant American flag, though there are many other classic scenes. One that comes to mind occurs during an unexpected German airstrike which finds General Patton hopping out a window and firing a pistol at the oncoming planes overhead. We realize Patton is a reckless, intrepid, maverick, a feverish jingoist whose unbreakable strength is only paralleled in his candor and his callousness. It begins in North Africa in Tunisia in 1943. The American troops of II Corps are demoralized after a devastating loss to the German leader Erwin Rommel at Kasserine. The Allied command looks to General Patton to restore discipline in order to secure victory, and that is exactly what he does. When Patton arrives, he immediately whips the troops into shape, starting with a rigid dress code. Then he secures a decisive victory in a battle of tank warfare in North Africa, proudly declaring to Rommel, "I read your book." Next, we see the invasion of Sicily. In a nod to Thucydides and the infamous Sicilian expedition from classical antiquity, Patton proposes a plan wherein Patton's British counterpart captures Syracuse while Patton cuts off the enemy inland at Messina. The plan is scrapped by General Eisenhower, who instead favors a more steady, cautious approach. However, Patton grows impatient and, defying orders, he marches his troops through Sicily anyway, capturing both Palermo and Messina, comparing himself to the Greeks, Romans, Persians, Byzantines, Arabs, and so on who came before him. Patton's stunt withers his trust with Central Command, despite the fact that he was correct in his assessment. In addition, Patton faces another scandal when he is forced to apologize for his uncouth behavior. While in Italy, he makes an infamous visit to a hospital where he encounters a soldier suffering from battle fatigue, or what we might call today PTSD. Instead of supporting the soldier, Patton publicly berates him, slaps him, calls him a coward, and demands that he be immediately relocated to the front line. In truth, there were actually two such incidents, and they plagued Patton for the rest of his life. Throughout the film, his erratic nature is what allows for his success, but it also leads to his downfall. When Eisenhower announces an invasion of Normandy, Bradley is placed in command, instead of Patton. He lamentably lost his good standing among the generals. Patton's flaw is that he is not a political man like his foil General Bradley. Your worst enemy is your own big mouth. He is too ensconced in the Jungian warrior spirit, and his joie de vivre is contrasted with the cold bureaucracy of the military. In the rigid chain of command, the soldier diplomat reigns over the reckless, untamed conqueror. However, both types are mutually dependent upon one another. Patton is hated by his troops but loved for his victories. His persona is compared to the relics of warriors past: Ajax, Themistocles, Alexander the Great, Scipio, Caesar, Henry V, Napoleon, and so on. In fact, Patton did truly believe he was the living reincarnation of great historical warriors from antiquity. He was apparently quite a superstitious man. At any rate, at the invasion of Normandy, Patton is placed in charge of a decoy British cohort intended to distract the Germans. Patton stumbles into another controversy when he claims the future post-war order will be dominated by the United States and Great Britain, neglecting to mention the Soviet Union, then allied with the US and Great Britain. After D-Day, Patton is given command of the Third Army, which plows through France, liberates Belgium, and performing the daring, record-breaking rescue of the 101st Airborne Division trapped at Bastogne. He then continues onward, invading Germany, but his controversies continue. In the end, we see the graying general walking his dog, reflecting on warfare in ancient Rome, and musing that all glory is fleeting, while we are given glimpses of his many controversies, and some have noted some minor historical inaccuracies, i.e. the real Patton had a much higher, squeakier voice than George C. Scott. However, for a 3-hour film, Patton covers a perfectly suited balance of warfare and quiet reflection, just enough for the audience to admire yet disdain the man. The film offers a strategically ambiguous stance on the controversial legacy of Patton. It is often accused of either being extremely hawkish, in glorification of war, and yet it is also chastised for being written by doves, afraid to showcase the true greatness of General Patton. In fact, I was reminded of Xenophon, the great warrior and writer from ancient Greece. In particular, his magnificent adventure the Anabasis of Cyrus is contrasted with his aging life of an honored veteran in Sparta. Elsewhere in the Hellenica, Xenophon considers what rare qualities must be present in a man who is capable of successfully commanding thousands. Surely George S. Patton was the embodiment of that man. General George S. Patton was one of the US top brass during the Second World War, serving in North Africa and on the Western Front. Outspoken and always controversial, he inspired either intense loyalty or abject loathing. The real General Patton was quite a card. An obsessive military history junkie who believed fervently in a Christian God and simultaneously in reincarnation, he loved war and killing with a passion that quite often tipped over into the distasteful. He was obsessed with the tiniest details of turnout, losing his rag if any soldier had untied shoelaces or 5 o'clock shadow. George C. Scott gives one of the all-time great screen performances in the title role, making the crazy old coot almost sympathetic without softening any of his rough edges. One thing he does soften is the voice, but that's understandable. Had he imitated the real Patton's Mickey Mouse squeak, it would have been impossible to take the movie seriously. The screenplay by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North is terrific, capturing Patton's flights of classical erudition just as convincingly as his tireless cussing. Often, the words used are actually Patton's own, though they have toned down some of the swearing. Patton himself would never have said fornication when there was another F word so readily to hand. Even in the imaginary opening sequence, when Patton pep talks straight to camera in front of a colossal Stars and Stripes, much of the dialogue is accurate. Americans love to fight. He barks. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war. Yes, well, this isn't real future. It's true that a lot of the military props, notably the tanks, are inaccurate models. However, these are more than compensated for by the energy of the film's battle sequences, including one where Patton gets his own revolvers out and starts firing at 2 low-flying Luftwaffe planes. Asked by a reporter about this famous pair of pearl-handled guns, Patton growls, "They're ivory. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans whorehouse would carry a pearl-handled pistol." In a momentary departure from the truth, Patton is desperate to make it through Sicily to Messina before the British General Montgomery. On his way, he visits a field hospital. Among the casualties is a young man who appears to be suffering from a nervous breakdown. Patton flies into a rage, "You're just a goddamn coward." Whacks sobbing soldier on the head with his leather gloves. "Won't have a yellow bastard sitting here crying in front of these brave men who've been wounded in battles. Shut up." Whack, send him up to the front. Unfortunately, this is a pretty accurate depiction of a real scene and, as in the movie, it nearly ended Patton's career. What is not mentioned here is that the supposedly shell-shocked soldier, Charles Cole, turned out to have been suffering from malaria. In the film, Patton's apology is shown to be grudging. In real life, he was genuinely remorseful. After the scandal, Patton is reduced to conducting military history tours, quite good ones, for fellow soldiers in Malta, and hanging around in a chintzy flat in London to confuse the Nazis. Finally, at the helm of the Third Army, he leads troops into battle to relieve the 101st Airborne, who are encircled at Bastogne. All accurate enough, though the verdict of one Nazi on this American general is not, the absence of war will kill him. Though Patton did die soon after the war, it was from the more mundane cause of injuries sustained during a car accident. It bends a few facts, and occasionally slips towards satire. But, for the most part, this is a remarkably enjoyable, and commendably fair, biopic of an unforgettable character. They don't make many films, or indeed generals, like this anymore. His first battle pits his troops against the famous German tank commander Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. Following the victory at Quais Rhin, Patton gives a high-level, formal dinner to promote his plans for invading Sicily. He wants to land his troops at Palermo, a city on the northwest corner of the island, then drive to Messina, the gateway to Italy located at the northeast of Sicily, while British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery invades Syracuse in the south and drives northward to Messina. By doing this, Patton's troops would cut off the escape route of the Germans. Patton's plan was nixed by the Allied High Command, and he was ordered to protect Monty's left flank on the mountainous road to Messina. Patton ignored the order, drove his troops to victory at Palermo, then beat Monty to Messina. This was the beginning of the war of egos between the commanders that would last throughout the war. Patton, 1970. During his march to Messina, Patton entered an army hospital to console the wounded and came across a soldier suffering from battle fatigue. Patton became enraged, slapped the soldier and threatened to shoot him, then ordered him to be sent to the front lines. This incident caused Patton to be subjugated to a decoy while the command of the American forces in Europe was given to Bradley. The decoy ploy worked as Germany scattered its troops to counteract Patton's movements. The ruse was especially effective during the Allied invasion of Normandy, D-Day. After the D-Day invasion, Patton was given command of the Third Army, which cut a swift path across France toward German soil but was redirected northward to thwart the last, desperate advance by the Germans, commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge. Patton, 1970. The film was released in 1970 during the height of the protest movement of the Vietnam War. It reminded the public of a time when Americans were proud of their involvement in military actions. Patton, released during the height of the Vietnam War, successfully had it both ways. It could be appreciated by hawks, as a celebration of Patton's courage and battlefield genius, and also by doves, as an exposure of his failings. Wilmington, 2002. The film was essentially accurate in its depiction of historical events, but a couple of aspects stood out as inaccurate, such as Patton's speech to his troops in which he apologized for the slapping incident. While he was indeed ordered to do so by Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower and did gather those under his command for the apology, in reality, his troops cheered for long and so loud at his arrival, he was never able to deliver the speech as the film depicted. Those words on the balcony were never spoken. The movie showed his blatant disregard for American casualties in favor of victory at any cost, which is fictional as his casualty rates were among the lowest in the European theater. Patton was neither cold nor insensitive. He cared deeply about those under his command who stood in the face of enemy fire and refused to yield. Berardinelli, 1994. One can learn a brief overview of the war and the integral part that Patton's armies played in the liberation of Europe and defeat of Germany, as it was based on, for the most part, historical events. Patton is a mini-history lesson of the war in Europe. A United States Army general finds his path to glory a difficult and contentious one, as director Franklin J. Schaffner explores the life of real-life General George S. Patton. The film, taking its title from the famed general's last name, is as conventional a war film as you can imagine. Interspersed in the biopic framework are scenes of battle and resultant carnage. However, the blend of biopic and war film is an interesting approach that ends up rewarding the viewer with an honest portrait of a man both loved and hated. George C. Scott makes Patton a harsh and overbearing presence on the screen. This is as the story would require. The real-life person was, from accounts, every bit the chauvinist and die-hard military supporter. His intolerance for laziness and incompetence was legendary, and his hatred of cowards was even more renowned. The film begins as Patton is first assigned to help shore up North African operations over General Omar Bradley, Karl Malden. Bradley wrote one of the books on which the film's screenplay by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund M. North is based. We see the determined man stamping out undisciplined actions such as restricting mess hours, requiring men to be in dress uniform at all times and to never go without wearing a helmet. He even tells the doctor who protests that he can't wear his stethoscope with his helmet on to drill holes in the sides. He successfully defeats plans by famed German commander Erwin Rommel, Karl Michael Vogler. He later goes out of his way to try and show up British historical figure Bernard Law Montgomery, Michael Bates, by marching into the north of the Isle of Sicily ahead of him. Contentious to a fault, Patton irritates his superiors with his frank vocabulary and intolerant behavior. His notorious slapping of a soldier in a military hospital suffering from nerves, landed him in hot water and prevented him from carving out the name he wanted in history. We learn a great deal about his knowledge of world military history. His inclusion among those greats is debatable, but he certainly carved out a niche of his own in history books. Scott is amazing as Patton. His performance creates in the audience the necessary confusion of emotions. On one hand, we can't help but admire his bravado and tactics. On the other, it's impossible not to despise his irascible actions. Malden's performance as the friendly and more likable alternative to Patton is good, but nowhere near as deep as the titular character. This has more to do with the narrative's insistence that Patton believed himself the only one important to military operations, and thus the film takes the same approach. We learn little of Patton's opponents both on the field of battle and in the military hierarchy. His narrow view of their actions is embodied in the magnificent Coppola/North script. If Patton suffers, it's because of its breadth. The film plods through military battles that would only be pleasing to those enjoy such things. It takes nearly 3 hours to get to the film's conclusion and could have taken less with more judicious editing. However, what exists is still an oft-compelling, oft-languid biographical look at the loved and hated General George S. Patton. It is said that war brings out the best and the worst in men. This has been appreciated by storytellers from the very beginnings of history, and some of the most important works of literature are stories about wars and the people who took part in them. In such extraordinary circumstances, all the emotions that make great drama, love, fear, hate, remorse, are brought to the extreme. The film industry did not fail to notice this, and some of the greatest films ever made are those that deal, in one way or another, with armed conflicts and the way they affect individuals and societies. War films are also a good way to show how the general perception of war tends to change through various periods, ranging from being condemned as senseless slaughter to being advocated as the extreme form of recreation. There are few films that take more than one perception of war, and it usually requires a special set of circumstances. In the case of Patton, the 1970 war film directed by Franklin J. Schaffner, those special circumstances were provided by one very special individual. General George S. Patton, Jr. 1885 to 1945, is not the most important, but he is definitely among the more colorful figures of American military history. As such, he was destined to have a film made about him. Since most people in today's world get their knowledge of military history through American films, Patton is probably the best-known general today. Born in an age when young boys dreamed of becoming great military heroes rather than big athletes or pop stars, Patton had his childhood wish granted at the expense of millions who perished in 2 world wars. Many episodes from his long and distinguished military career could have been included in the film, but the script, written by Francis Ford Coppola and based on the books by Lottie S. Lays Farrago and General Omar N. Bradley, concentrates on the last 3 years of Patton's life, when he left his most enduring impression on future historians. The film starts in November 1942, shortly before American forces are about to receive their baptism of fire in the war against Hitler and Mussolini. A few months later, their inexperience at Kasserine Pass results in a major defeat at the hands of the German Afrika Korps, led by the charismatic Field Marshal Rommel, played by Karl Michael Vogler. Due to his pre-war experience with tank warfare, General Patton, played by George C. Scott, is sent to take command of the demoralized troops, and he quickly establishes tight discipline. His methods begin to work, and the Germans and their Italian allies are gradually chased out of North Africa. During the Sicily campaign, Patton learns that the Germans and Italians are not the only enemies he has to worry about. A great rivalry emerges between him and the British commander, Bernard Law Montgomery, played by Michael Bates. Another issue is Patton's bad temper and fast mouth, which lead to a series of embarrassing incidents and almost destroy his career. He is given a second chance in France in 1944 and rewards his superiors' trust with a series of brilliant victories. Once the war ends, it soon becomes clear that the skills and character traits that had served Patton very well on the battlefield are liabilities in the peacetime world built on diplomacy, tolerance, and compromise. Patton features one of the most effective openings in the history of cinema, the protagonist in his most splendid uniform, decorated with medals and with a huge American flag as the background, delivers one of the most powerful and jingoistic speeches imaginable. The image itself became the most popular icon of American militarism, while the speech with its brutal bluntness reduces the whole nature of war to a few simple, universal truths. The biggest flaw of Patton is that the subsequent scenes lack the power of that opening. It is also the strangest moment in the film. Hearing words about America never losing a war was almost a surreal experience during the last years of the Vietnam fiasco. It is hard to imagine how someone generally perceived as a militaristic icon could be portrayed as a hero in an age when militarism, patriotism, and any ism associated with the establishment began to drift away from popular sentiments. Coppola's script offers an answer to that question by carefully emphasizing certain parts of Patton's biography and character. He is portrayed as a poet, he believes in reincarnation, he freely speaks his mind and does not care about language, he ignores and disobeys his superiors, he defies conventional wisdom and well-established rules and, last but not least, he does what he does because he likes it rather than for such prosaic reasons as money or a sense of duty. Needless to say, these are the character traits that were associated with the social values and unconventional lifestyles adopted by the rebellious 1960s youth. The ironic twist in Coppola's Patton is that he does not rebel in order to create a brave new world, but in order to return to an idealized past. In the case of this film, that idealist past is the past of wars that were adventures, armies made of professional individuals, and personal bravery and honor being more important than political skills. The flaw in the script is in the things Coppola omitted from Patton's biography, some being too controversial, his role in the shooting of prisoners and his anti-Semitism, and some that could have added more complexity to his character. For example, Patton is portrayed as an almost anachronistic romantic, the last old-fashioned warrior. In reality, Patton was one of the most progressive officers in the U.S. military, especially in the area of armored warfare, a concept that few militaries took seriously until World War II. Coppola is more consistent while portraying another contradiction in Patton's character. Towards common soldiers, he showed almost simple-minded brutality more suitable for drill sergeants, while remaining at the same time a well-educated, refined, and soft-spoken intellectual. To say that George C. Scott played Patton brilliantly would be an understatement. This role, which he repeated in the 1986 TV film The Last Days of Patton, is famous not only for his truly memorable performance, but also for Scott's decision not to accept the Oscar. In any case, that Oscar was well deserved, and the film, with or without the extra gold statue, displays one of the finest acting jobs ever done. Scott's role is complemented by the equally powerful performance of Karl Malden, who plays Patton's close friend, and the film's chief technical advisor, General Omar N. Bradley. His presence prevents Patton from turning into an uncritical praise of its protagonist. Bradley, who was a very different kind of general, more aware of the true nature of modern wars, gives moral balance to the story. Through Bradley, a quiet, unassuming fellow who admires his friend but does not shy away from his shortcomings, the audience is anchored to the reality that Patton failed to see. Despite having a film almost exclusively concentrated on a single individual, director Franklin J. Schaffner gives this film an epic scope. 3 years, probably the most intense period in the history of mankind, are skillfully compressed into 3 hours of a movie, and even those with little knowledge of the complicated strategic and political background can enjoy the film. Scenes of dialogue and character exposure are woven into the scenes of battles, which are spectacular, effective, and convincing, despite the rival armies, both played by 1960s Spanish military, using tanks produced after World War II, a detail that would, ironically, bother only Patton-like military buffs. Jerry Goldsmith provides this film with one of the most effective and most recognizable scores in the history of cinema, which, just like the opening image, became forever associated with American militarism. At the beginning of this movie, General George S. Patton, played by George C. Scott, stands in front of a large American flag delivering a rousing pep talk to his troops. His brash, sometimes graphic, exhortation to show no mercy to the enemy is liberally laced with profanities. This address, containing quotes from speeches Patton really delivered, acts as an introduction to the man whose life is about to be examined for the next 3 hours. This indelible first impression also helps to color the filmmaker's carefully constructed portrait of the controversial World War II leader. Privy to this personality preview, the audience will not be surprised when Patton is chosen to go to North Africa to shape up the soldiers after the Americans suffers a crushing, and embarrassing, defeat during a German attack. Under his no-guff grasp, and thanks to his insatiable reading about military history and stratagem, his army is successful at pushing back the German forces. This film, directed by Franklin J. Schaffner, screenplay by Francis Ford Coppola, based on Patton, Ordeal and Triumph, produced by Frank McCarthy, starring George C. Scott, cinematography Fred J. Koenikamp, edited by Hugh Fowler, music by Jerry Goldsmith, color process color by Deluxe, distributed by 20th Century Fox, release dates February 5, 1970, running time 172 minutes, country United States, language English, budget $12.6 million, box office $61.7 million.